let me go ahead and formally begin our session with a little bit of a code switch. We just had the World Christianity Conference here last week as well that Princeton Seminary hosted. Within the field of world Christianity, there's a lot of scholars of African Christianity. And so it's very, very common to use language of the ancestors. And I want to introduce that language into our session as we begin, because John Swinton is most certainly a living ancestor when it comes to the work of qualitative research and theology, and has set the table for so many scholars. And so it's an absolute joy and privilege to be able to welcome him here digitally, to share a little bit about his growth. Again, the topic that we framed each of these conversations is, how has my mind changed? How has John Swinton's mind changed in regards to this work? And it's also a privilege to invite Christian Scharen and Eileen Campbell to be the interlocutors for this conversation. Both of them working very closely, not just with theology and ethnography, but with pastoral experience. They've been spearheading a project around what they call pastoral imagination. And we all know Christian Scharen and Anna Marie Vigen's text has been key for many of us in framing this sort of work. So it's great to be able to convene this conversation. And with that said, I'm going to turn the table over to Christian, Eileen, and John.
Great. I'm going to kick us off, John. And first of all, just such gratitude for your being a colleague over the years, both in the Ecclesiology and Ethnography Network and in other ways generally. And I'm so delighted you said yes. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome, Chris. Can I just one thing I said? I couldn't see you. All I could see was an empty plinth, which was perhaps a sign. I've got you now.
Oh, you can't see me?
I can see you now.
Oh, you can see me now. Okay, great.
Yeah.
We have a great tech team here, and I'm grateful for them. Their work is hidden, but it just showed up visibly for us. I was reflecting with Eileen about the way in which we come to our work as practical theologians, having also been pastors, and we were thinking about your work, John, and multi-vocational tracks that have been a part of your life. And we thought it might be interesting to invite you into the conversation by reflecting a little on how it's influenced your role as a practical theologian and scholar to have been and still be a nurse and to have served as a chaplain also, like multiple vocational trajectories that you hold together in your person. And so maybe open up with reflecting a little bit about your own vocational journey and how you came to those various roles and how you see them interplaying in the way that you hold your academic work.
Yeah. Yep. You're right. My life has been an interesting journey. So I began life, my professional life, as a mental health nurse. And so I worked in the area of psychiatry for 16 years or so, initially in the area of mental health, and then I retrained and worked in the area of intellectual disability, which then was mental deficiency, then became mental handicap, then became a learning disability, and so on and so forth. And it's really interesting the way these labels shift and change as culture shifts and changes. There's something important about that. And so all of my formative years as a healthcare professional were spent with people who saw the world differently, who had different experiences from the day-to-day experiences that I'd been used to, and who also had differing experiences of God. You know, what does it mean to really experience God when you're going through a really elated period of bipolar disorder, for example? What is that, that kind of what professionals would say is excessive religiosity, but for the individual, it's something very powerful. What does that mean for an individual, both in terms of what does it mean to know God in the context of interesting experiences, but also what does it mean to understand a particular experience as spiritual when it seems to be pathological? So all of these questions were formative for me, really, as I began to grow into my vocation as a mental health nurse, then latterly as a mental health chaplain. And so when I made a decision to move from nursing into the academy, a long time ago. The obvious thing for me to do was to begin to think about my professional life as a nurse and as a healthcare professional. And so my nursing and healthcare work was my formation. It shaped and formed me to look at the world in a particular way and gave me a set of questions. And my academic world then became my place of vocation, where I asked, well, where is God in the midst of all of that? And so the questions that emerged from my professional experience were the questions that I began to ask when I got into the academy. And for me, one of the fascinating things about practical theology is the way in which it challenges and causes dissonance simply by asking different kinds of questions. So when I came to the academy, I had a whole variety of questions, like, what does it mean to know Jesus when you no longer remember who Jesus is? What does it mean to know God when you never had the kind of cognitive capacity to know God? And these questions are great questions because they're not questions that are normally asked. You know, if you're sitting in your office working out theology, these are not the questions that you normally come to mind. But if you're a pastor or if you're a person that's living in the world in various ways, these are really important questions. And when you take these questions and place them beside a tradition, you see things differently. It's like looking at a diamond really from a different angle or shining a different light, and suddenly you see things quite different. Knowledge of God becomes different. What it means to be a disciple becomes different. And not different in the sense as everything else is terrible and this is the new way to look at it, but just different in the terms, in the sense that the richness of what it means to be a human being comes to the fore. And so that idea of formation and vocation probably is the way that I came to be the kind of theologian that I am.
If I could just throw in one more aspect of the vocational question, and that is being Presbyterian, like coming to this all from a particular ecclesial place, and how your own church affiliation with the Church of Scotland played a role in the way in which you thought about chaplaincy and the way that you think about the practical theological work that you do. Yeah, well, clearly everything I've done has been preordained, so I take no credit whatsoever. But yeah, being a Presbyterian is interesting, particularly in the areas that I work in, because Presbyterianism has a particular shape, a particular ecclesiology, and a particular understanding of what knowledge of God is. And so everything's to do with words and cognition and intellect and various other things, like, which is nothing wrong with that, like, but it just makes it difficult when you're working with people who don't necessarily function in that way, like. And so I'm glad to be a Presbyterian, and I'm glad to be a member of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, because it's given me a particular way of thinking theologically that's helpful in certain theological concepts, but I still see it as problematic when it can encounter certain types of people. So it is my formative theological discipline, but it's one which I'm always wrestling with, not wrestling to get away with, but just wrestling to try and get at the depth of it and get an understanding of it in different kinds of contexts. So it's been very important for me.
Hi, John.
Hi, Evan.
Good to see you. You're very,
Absolutely.
very, just saying, way up there. Oh, but behind me, you're huge. That's right.
Well, I'm sneaking around behind you, so you're all right.
Awesome. I want to build on what we've been talking about your vocation, and ask a question that kind of heard first from Ted Smith, who's another theologian that Chris and I both worked with and learned from. And he talks about the ways the books we write shape us as scholars and persons. And I'm thinking back to the first book you wrote with Harriet, and that book is read. Probably everybody in this room has been assigned that book at some point, and people have read it. And so I have two questions. One is about, how did writing that book, or any other you want to talk about, contribute to shaping your own identity as a scholar, practitioner? And then I'll ask a second question after you consider that one. Okay.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, one of the book was formative for me. You're quite right. Books do that. Like, there's another thing I'll say about books in a minute. But working alongside Harriet Mowat was actually a great help, because I think that interdisciplinary work is actually, when it's done properly, and when it's done in the context of friendship and genuine dialogue, is a way of opening up space that is actually not there for the single theologian. And so working alongside of Harriet, we didn't always agree with everything, but she was a very good partner. Enabled me to see what the social sciences were in and of themselves. And so I didn't begin with a critique of the social sciences. I began to learn what social science was. I wasn't, and I'm still not a social scientist, but she is. And she's not a theologian, but I am. So it was in that hospitable dialogue between the two of us, as we were able to take seriously both disciplines, that book came to fruition. And my hope and intention is that book it respects social scientific perspectives, but just simply doesn't allow it to define the theological task. And so I think that interdisciplinary conversation between Harriet and I that went on for a long time has shaped and formed the kinds of interdisciplinary conversations that have been central to pretty much all of my work that's come from there, whether that works in the context of disability or mental health or whatever it is. I learned to listen, I think, through that partnership.
Wow, that's really, I mean, I love hearing about the partnership and how generative it has been. And I'm wondering, since I think there's a brand new version of a revised version of the book that's out now, right? And I'm wondering, so this question about how our mind has changed, I wondered if you would reflect with us about how your mind has changed about that work from when you first wrote the book to now, either with the revision in mind or not. But how has your mind changed about this qualitative research over these years?
Well, to be honest, I don't know if my mind has changed. But I think I've think differently about a number of key things. One of the things that I think I do think differently about, different in a sense, being just have a thicker understanding, is the nature of theology. Because one of the things that struck me, and I read through that book the other day, and strangely, I quite like it still, because I tend not to like anything I do. So I was quite pleased that I was able to get something peaceful out of it. Is that the understanding of theology, there's two things. The understanding of theology there tends to be focused on intellectual theology, concepts and ideas. Nothing wrong with that, but there's other dimensions that I've come to know that are very significant. And also, and this is not simply a concern for myself, is it tends to be make the assumption that theology is always positive. And I wrote a book last year on evil, because evil is my favorite subject. I've got a lot of expertise in evil. And it was really, really interesting. And one of the chapters, which was a very depressing chapter, was looking at the Rwandan genocide and exploring the theological dynamics that went on within that. And it's a classic example of theology that's just gone bad. You know, people would go to church on Easter week, would leave church and then go out and kill the people. And so that the inherent goodness that we often assume was within theology is not necessarily always there. And I learned that through that project on evil, but I think now it's more important. And Leah Robinson's got a new book coming out that's looking at good and bad theology around these issues. And it's a very good book. So I think that is not to assume that the theology is necessarily good, and always to be as critical as possible in a constructive way of the way in which theology is done and the implications of what theology is. But in relation to the nature of theology and that idea that my temptation to move into propositional theology, I've just come to recognize that theology actually is more than simply knowing things about God. It's to do with knowing God. So in James, the book of James, James says, you know, the demons know more about God than you do. So go out and look after the widows and the orphans. And you see the same thing in Jeremiah 22:16, when Jeremiah is talking about a good king. He says, why is a good king? King Josiah is talking about, because he looks after the widows and orphans. Then there's a little text that Walter Brueggemann picks up on and says, is that not what it means to know me? And Brueggemann's interpretation of that is that actually knowing God is a social practice. It's something we do with our minds, of course we do, if that's a possibility for us, but we also do with our body. And the point would be that looking after the windows of an office is part of the process of knowing God. It's not you come to know God and then do that. Then I think that's a crucial distinction there. So getting that distinction between knowing things about God, which could be arguably what the academic task often is, and knowing God is something that I've been wrestling with. And I think I haven't changed my mind about propositional theology. I still think it's important, but I just think there's a thinness there that needs to be thickened up by a deeper reflection on what the love of God looks like.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
I have so many questions out of that, John. I don't know where to start, but where you just ended leads me, I think, into one of your recent books, Finding Jesus in the Storm, and you're evoking thin and thick descriptions. And I was so struck in that book by the way in which, and you started right out in this conversation talking about how in a sense labels change over time for particular what you might call diagnoses or circumstances that people experience in their lives. And you start out that book talking about the challenges for people with disabilities and mental health challenges around how their experience is externally named. And that phrase that you use in the beginning of the book, living under a description, it felt to me like very resonant with your work in relationship to people with disabilities, with mental illness, but also many people who are othered and live under those descriptions, which very often ethnographers have offered them or social scientists have offered them. And so I just wanted to invite your reflection in this group. Maybe not everyone has read that book, Finding Jesus in the Storm, but the way in which you draw out Michael Walser's language around thin and thick descriptions in this context, and especially in thinking about ethnographic work and how we offer descriptions that then people have to live under them. There's an ethical power to that, but also a pastoral power, I think, in terms of your sense of how you do this work with a sense of God's presence, of Jesus' presence in the midst of your work. At least I would assume what I know about you. So it's not really a question, but more an area of reflection that I found very generative and important. And I wanted, since you named it just there at the end, I wanted to invite you to take that and open it up a little bit more deeply for us.
Well, I mean, qualitative research obviously is an observational, interpretative venture. And so language becomes really important. The language that we use to describe the world is profoundly important. And underpinning that book, which is a phenomenological account of the experiences of Christians who live with mental health challenges. And so I'll come back to the phenomenological bit in a second, but the underlying premise is that the way that you see the world, the language that you use to describe the world describes what you think you see. And what you think you see determines how you act on what you think you see. So language itself has profound practical implications. And so the simple thing, a good example would be a mental health diagnosis like schizophrenia, right? So when if you have influenza, people don't call you the flu. But if you have schizophrenia, people talk about you as a schizophrenic, and you ask yourself, what is that? Is it like a Spaniard or a New Yorker? But it's that language itself, distance. And as soon as you distance yourself from somebody, then they become less than human, and therefore your practices become highly significantly implicated by the name or the label that you've used. And that has important theological implications, because one thing that the Genesis account of creation tells us, when God says to Adam, name the animals, name the creatures, and these creatures come into existence, and the names are, when Adam does that, is that naming things properly is a primal responsibility of human beings, and naming things badly is a manifestation of sin, which has all sorts of implications for the world in that way. And so I think it's very important, and this takes them to the phenomenological dimension, it's very important that qualitative researchers recognize, particularly when you're working in an interdisciplinary context, recognize the power of the language and power of the kinds of descriptions that they come up with, because they're not only descriptive, they're very often practically transformative. And so one of the things that I tried to do in that book was to use phenomenology to help to get beyond that. So phenomenology, as you'll know, is a way of a philosophical approach that tries best you can to put to one side your assumptions about the phenomenon that you're looking at. So you put to one side your kind of cultural assumptions about what schizophrenia is, or depression is, or bipolar disorder is. Put that to one side as best as you can, and then try to listen to and to see the thing in itself, which in this context means to listen to people's stories before they become overlaid with theories of explanation. Now, one of the problems for theologians very often in mental health and many other contexts is that we begin with a description that comes from another discipline. So maybe in this case, to stick with it, we begin with a description that comes from psychiatry or psychology. And then we build our theology on top of that, as if that actually is the thing in itself. And then we have a theologized psychology or a theologized psychiatry. What I'm trying to suggest is that we do something different. We put to one side psychiatry and psychology as big, powerful cultural voices that describe things, not because we don't want to engage with them, but because that might not be the best place to start. Because before there was psychology and psychiatry, there was God. In other words, there's a doctrine of creation that underpins your conversation with any other discipline. And so in this case, psychiatry and psychology are secondary disciplines because you already are located in the world in a particular way. And if we forget that, then we discover interesting things, but we actually may well be misled in terms of the way that we interpret things. So phenomenology enables us to put that to one side, listen to people's stories. And when you listen to people's stories, you begin to see that a lot of the things that you assume about the experience, in this case, of people going through profound mental health challenges is not the way you think it is. And that the way in which theology and spirituality works itself out in people's lives is much deeper, much richer, much thicker, and much more interesting than we might assume if all we see is, well, these are a set of symptoms rather than these are a set of meaningful experiences. And so that book, again, talking about what you've learned, what you've unlearned, that taught me to listen in a particular way.
John, can I jump in about a similar kind of approach that I got to? Like, I came at it differently, but I hear some resonance with what you were saying. I think we maybe arrived in different ways. I was trained in a program at Vanderbilt in both psychology and theology, or the social sciences and practical theological approaches. And I studied history and a lot of other things as a part of that program, which took seriously the sort of whole approach to how we understand. Anyway, I came to this idea. Richard Karp is I think he's actually an art historian who helped me get to this sense of how we see. And he thought about, he works on interdisciplinarity among different kinds of in the university, the ways interdisciplinary works. There's all different ways it works. But in hearing him talk about that, I came to realize that for me as a pastoral and practical theologian, just looking at things through the lens of psychology gave me actually not just labels. So getting beneath what you were talking about, the psychological labels for someone, actually looking with real intention and time about how someone's psychology works. What's going on in their minds, what's driving them. That's also influenced by the cultural milieu where they are. That gave me one set of ways of understanding what was going on with people in a real depth way. I studied Freud and Kohut and Winnicott and all the rest. And those gave me really rich frameworks for understanding what was going on with people. But I also had these really powerful theological frameworks that were operational in me and that I studied. And what I began to articulate for myself was that when I just looked with one or the other, I got a certain kind of thing. But when I actually looked with both, I wasn't, it did what Karp says, you get beyond looking two-dimensionally at anything. And actually, when you look with depth at through different lenses, you open up the third dimension. You open up something that's neither one nor the other. And one of the real gifts for me of being in a program where I had sustained study in two really different kinds of fields was that something else opened up that I don't really have a name for about the way I see people and communities and the way dynamics unfold. And it's hard to articulate that without, rushing to put a name on it. But it actually is what helped me realize that I am a practical and pastoral theologian, not systematic theologian by any means. I'm not a psychologist, but I use frameworks from both. And it gives me a third dimension, something different than either one of them alone can give me. So I try to honor the value of what social sciences have taught us, because they came to exist for the ways theology was failing to understand human experience. And so I want to regain and maintain conversations with both. Similar, but not exactly the way you got to.
No, but I completely agree with it. It's like a dialectic. It's really, and when the two come together well, then you can find something special in both of them. Like the only, and I guess there is, it has to do with hospitality between the two, and there are things that can be learned when you have that kind of conversation, because both sides have blind spots. It's interesting because in the US, you have the manual for diagnostic criterion for mental health issues is the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorder. But in Europe, it tends to be the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, come from the World Health Organization. And it goes through various iterations. But DSM, ICD-11 just came out last year or the year before. And as part of the preparatory process for that, they did a study looking at asking the opinions of service users, people who were going through the experience of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, personality disorder, anxiety, as to what they thought about the ways in which psychiatry, psychology were framing their experience. It's a fascinating piece of research. But one of the things that came out of that was that people, particularly people living with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, would looked at the way in which it was framed and said, but there's nothing good in there. Because all you're looking for is things that go wrong. And they say, what about creativity? What about relationships? So, but that's not because psychiatry or psychology get things wrong in that sense. It's just because that's the focus and the angle they have. And that's the beauty of the kind of conversation you're having, is that you can have your consciousness raised to issues that you just can't see on your own. And so the way you described that just now, about that third thing that comes, I really like that, because it's a bit like conscientization, isn't it? Like suddenly you realize, oops, I'm not seeing the world properly. When you see the world properly, both of you can act better within your different fields.
Thank you. And it helps me to also say that I hold that both of those are mutually critical with each other. That's a given for me, but I didn't say it out loud a minute ago. Psychology, I said a little of the psychological critique to religion, where religion failed to understand the human experience at certain points. The social sciences emerged at that, 150 years ago. But also conversely, there's places where you're just describing where the psychological commitments of the profession of psychology have failed by reducing people to a list of, if you've got these 10 criteria, you're schizophrenic. That's very reductive. And yeah. One of the beauties of theology is bringing this really rich sense that this is a human being created by something beyond themselves, and we can't reduce them to a list of things on a page ever.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
John, we explicitly tried to invite at this conference, at this gathering, doctoral students and early career scholars. And you and I and Eileen are not in that place anymore. But when I think back to when I first was looking at doctoral programs, what I wanted to do in bringing these fields together of theology and qualitative research, doctoral programs just shook their head and said, we don't do that. You know, I ended up at Emory University because it was the only place that like said, oh yeah, you can do that here. And so I realized that the circumstances in this network and the conversations that it encourages have changed for emerging scholars, but nonetheless, like there's still a lot of challenges to move into academic life. And so you've done a lot of supervision and teaching of graduate students in your context. And I want to push on that space in terms of what you've learned, how you've grown as a supervisor, as a director, and as a mentor for people who are emerging into these fields and these conversations that we're a part of. And what advice would you have for the group who's gathered here about starting out and establishing oneself?
Yeah, it's funny, Chris, because last week my 41st doctoral student came through their final examination. And I suddenly realized how old I was. But anyway, put that to one side. The first thing I would say in relation to qualitative research is only do it if you have to do it. Because the students come through me and they very often when they're starting off, they feel that they have to do qualitative research. Because it's interesting because you're saying, you know, a few years ago, nobody was doing it. And now everybody that comes through assumes that you have to do it, and you don't have to do it. I would say the only reason that you'd want to do qualitative research is if you can't get the information, the data that you want from other sources, because it's a lot of work. It takes up a lot of your study time. It takes a lot of your life. And if you don't have to do it, if somebody else has done it, then just use their stuff. So make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons, i.e. because there's no other way of doing it. So I think that's important. Secondly, one of the challenges I think is that there is no, at least here, there's no formal training in qualitative research. What happens with us is that we're fortunate that we have three out of our four practical theologians have expertise in qualitative research, so they're able to do that through. So I think a space that could be very usefully filled is to have an international online program of research focused on research methods that people who are going into doctoral work can A, engage in, but B, also come into contact with other people who are engaging with that. And that might be a project for the Ecclesiology and Ethnography network wants to think about at some point. So I think that's very helpful then. The third thing is, if possible, engage with other social scientists. I know that you're not social scientist, but you engage with social scientists. In Aberdeen, we have a network, it's basically called the Qualitative Network, Qualitative Research Network. And it was set up by one of my grad students a few years ago who came to Aberdeen, discovered that she wanted to use qualitative research, but there was nobody else that was doing it at that time. So she moved across, spoke to people in sociology and anthropology, and they were really interested because there was other students there that felt equally as isolated. So now there's a network across the university where it gets together once a month or whatever it is, and just to bring together the qualitative dimensions of their projects. Now, they wouldn't necessarily bring the theological dimensions because you've got an interdisciplinary group there that may not be either interested or able to see that connection. But by listening to different ways in which it's done in sociology and anthropology and ultimately in theology, that's been a really helpful thing in the midst of that. So that, I think, is something that's worthwhile thinking about in whatever context that you're in. And the final thing I would say is just be honest. It's a complicated process. that can be exhausting, because, you know, gathering data, analyzing data, transcribing in particular just drives you nuts. Like if you're very rich, get somebody to transcribe for you. But of course, other people would say that transcription is actually really, really important because you immerse yourself in the data. That's true, but you kind of have it. You kind of you do immerse yourself in it, but it's exhausting. But do what you like. But what I would say is that the process is complex and difficult and exhausting, but it's absolutely beautiful. When you come through that process, and there'll be points when you think you're not fine with what you do. When you come through that and discover that you and your participants have created something new, something that at the beginning of your research process didn't exist, now exists because of the conversations you've had, that's a really, really rewarding thing to have in that sense. So although it's difficult, hard work, hard road, the outcome is beautiful.
Thank you. And I'm sure people will want to follow up on that. I was laughing to myself as you started, because yesterday in the plenary, Pete said, just do a very small project, just like a test project. Don't do some big expansive project. And then today you say, don't even do a project.
Well, everybody's different.
I want to invite you to reflect on one further area, and I'll see if Eileen wants to follow up before we open it up to the wider group. But I think maybe the most consequential article that Eileen and I have written together is called Ethnography on Holy Ground. And in that article, we make an explicit case against a certain kind of scientism in borrowing social science methods for theological work, and make a constructive argument for, in our case, using prayer as an integral part of our ethnographic practice. And just for fun, I went back to that very first Ecclesiology and Ethnography volume that Pete edited and that you wrote a chapter in, John, and you raised the question of prayer as method and what role, as a Christian doing ethnography, spiritual practice or prayer as a specific example might play. And so how do you think about that now, like the adjacency of one's own faith and positionality as a person of faith in the ethnographic moment or in research? How do you think about it? How do you advise students about that?
Yeah, well, I was quite shocked that you stole my idea, but there you go. My idea of prayer. I created the idea of prayer, you see. What do I think about that? Well, I still think that's fundamentally important, because I think when it's done well, when it's done theologically, qualitative research is a formative process. It's part of your spiritual dimension as you engage with your participants, as you engage with the issues around what you are. I think there's a spiritual process that goes on in the midst of that. The question I guess that you're asking me is about whether or not overt spiritual practices become part of your methodology. And I think there's a tension there, because within the academy, there are certain criterion for validation and certain criterion for what is considered to be acceptable, authentic, etc., which it would be very difficult. It might be very difficult to persuade them to take seriously. So if you wrote into your methodological section that you prayed and that your prayers were answered, and that was the reason you made your next decision, then that may be true. But I suspect that the examiner of your thesis might have a few questions in terms of the validity of the project that you do. But at the same time, I do think that's a problem with the academy, that maybe we need to think about, are there ways in which we can think about validating qualitative data which incorporate the kinds of spiritual practice that are fundamental to the reflexivity of the researcher, but actually can be very difficult to articulate in the context of an academic piece of work. So I think at minimum, we probably should continue to have that conversation. But I think that there's always going to be problems, there's always going to be problems first, full stop. And there'll be more problems in academic institutions that see themselves as quite apart from the church, or quite apart from personal, denominational, spiritual practices. So there's certain aspects, certain parts of the practical theology community might be comfortable with that. Other parts would be very uncomfortable with that. So I think it's an ongoing conversation, but I would still say prayer remains central, whether you articulate it in writing or whether you just articulate it in your life.
Thanks, John. I think in a way, Chris, you've been asking John to reflect with a kind of a phrase that we just used in an article that's just come out about an overview of our 10-year, where we are at the 10-year mark of our research. And the question was, how does one become wise in the practice of research? And so I wonder if you would reflect with us for a few minutes about something that's changed for you about the way you do research over these years since you started doing it as a doctoral student, and then how you're doing it now, and one aspect of it, or whatever you like.
You know, it's funny, you can chime in on this too, John, but Eileen and I were laughing this morning about how our own framework of learning ministry over time and going from being very self-conscious about getting it right and following the rules and so forth, eventually gives way to being more confidently present to the circumstance that you're in, whether it's a hospital room and what's going on in the hospital room, or in a Sunday worship service or what have you, and being able to notice what's important and respond to it. And I feel like there's been a similar kind of trajectory with research, where when I was starting out, I was like reading these books about like 15 different methodologies in the social sciences and just feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to do like any of these correctly, and I can't keep them all straight. And then eventually I realized, oh, that guy just invented a name for his research because he wanted to get tenure. And so now there's this other, form of doing qualitative research. And I had the gift, I think, of a mentor at Emory, Steve Tipton, who is a very experienced qualitative researcher and who I think was wise and encouraged me, like, the first time you do an interview, things will occur to you that seem significant, and note those. Don't wait till you get the very end and transcribe all your data and run it through some processing machine that gives you the answer. No, follow your intuition about what you're learning along the way. And so it started me, that put this idea in my mind that over time, like the conscious or self-conscious worry about following the rules of proper qualitative research would give way to something more intuitive and more, I think, wise about learning about human persons and communities and cultures and what's at stake there. And not doing that in a way that's naive. Like, the naivete is more at the beginning. Like, if anything, I've become more and more critical of my own assumptions. So that still plays a part. But I think I've been much more willing to be at ease in the mess and be at ease in the intuitive tracks that I might follow to see where that leads, and say, is this where this is going? And that just didn't happen when I was starting out. And so I think that's important as a way to say, it never gets easier to do a new project, but it's easier for me to be in a new project because I think I've become more at ease with myself as a researcher and what the process looks like and what my own process of learning in the midst of a project is. Yeah. That resonate with you at all, John?
Yes, good. No, I really like that. I mean, qualitative research, it's a little bit like jazz, isn't it? I mean, when you start off, you need to stick with the framework, you stick with the song, and you have to continue to know the song. But once you get a bit more confident with it, you can improvise. And when you improvise, that's when interesting things begin to happen in that sense. But you've got to know the script. So to begin with, it's like learning a new language. You've got to know the grammar, you've got to know the basic concepts, and then you can do all sorts of things once you're comfortable. But also in terms of choosing a method, I think people need to choose a method that they personally resonate with. So I would be a useless quantitative researcher because I don't have that kind of personality. I'm also not very good with statistics, so it's not a good combination. But so qualitative research and phenomenology in particular, because I like getting into things, I like looking at depths of things. It suits my personality. And so at least, I'm not saying that's all you have to do, but make sure that whatever method you have suits your personality, that you're not trying to fit your shoe into a glass slipper that's not your size, because you will find a space, a way, a form method that suits you.
Should we turn to, okay, let's turn to questions you might have. Things that have come up for you, have been listening to the conversation, and we'll have a full room conversation. We have about 15 minutes left.
Yes. You have about 15 minutes. Well, we'll start here and then go over here. Please speak clearly into the microphone so John can hear you.
Hi, John. This is Katie Douglas. I don't think you can see me, but I have a question for you that's going to expose like how little I know. Every time I start a project, I read I go back to the books of like, is this a grounded theory? Is this ethnography? Is this a case study? And every time I start off, I think this is a phenomenology. And then as I start doing it, I'm like, it's not. It's something different. But could you just tell us, or teach us what makes something, how do you think about phenomenology? How do you define it? How do you identify that your project is in fact a phenomenology as opposed to something else?
Yeah, I mean, I read some qualitative research projects, and I'm fairly convinced that some people decide what their method is at the end. And so they've actually done a lot of the work, and then they put a name to it. But I think it actually is important that you're clear about the kind of philosophical framework that you're working within. And so if you're thinking about doing something like phenomenology, you need to read about phenomenology, because it's a particular way of looking at the world, but it's also a particular way of interviewing. So if you were doing a more generalized qualitative research, your interviews might last for 40 minutes or so. For phenomenology interview, they can last for an hour and a half to 2 hours. And the reason for that is you're trying to get into the deep depths of a person's experience, and that takes time. It takes time for them to settle in. It takes time for them to find their rhythm of what kind of questions work, and so on and so forth. And so at the end of that time, you've got a lot of data, but at the same time, it's taken you a lot of time. So you for something like phenomenology, you have to make a decision early on that that's what I'm going to do, because the actual process is slightly different from if you were doing grounded theory, where you'd actually be doing something quite a different approach to interviewing, because you have a different intended outcome. And so whilst you're not tied to that, your method early on, you're wise to have your method in mind to see whether or not it fits what you want. Will get you the information that you want to get you, and then you can make your decisions after that. But having said that, you're right that a lot of methods look quite similar, and the key thing is what do you want your method to do for you, right? So methods are sometimes mystified. But methods are basically like the tool that you need to gather the data that you want to get. So if you want to dig a hole in your back garden, find a spade and not a fork, like a dinner fork. And it's as simple as that. So at least part of that process of discernment as to what kind of method you should be using has to do with what kind of information do you want? Do you want deep, in-depth information, phenomenology? Do you want a broad range of opinions, focus groups? Do you want to generate a theory that may or may not be applied within your study? Then you've got grounded theory. So the outcome is also important in terms of which method you choose.
Great. I want to be mindful of our online participants as well. So Dustin, we'll come to you next. But first, Gustavo Santos, would you like to share your question with us?
Yeah, sure. Hi, John. Can you see me here?
Hi, Gustavo. I
Yeah,
can't
good to
see you.
us. You mentioned something about actually your words were like knowing God is a social practice, right? And so much of our social life and practice has expanded, let's say, to the online environment like we're doing here right now. So how does that, like, what kind of reflection do you have in terms of that kind of expansion to the virtual space as a social interaction space as well, for qualitative research, in terms of limitations, challenges, opportunities, experiences that you had? What can you tell us about that?
I think it's definitely an opportunity in the sense that you're now able to do in-depth interviews with people across the world. So you can sit in your office and you can get experience from any different continent, any different, a whole broad range of people. And that opens up space that you, without social media, you wouldn't have that. Like, so there's something beautiful about, or important about being able to get to reach voices that you wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. The disadvantage is that it's a very different form of communication that you have when you're online. So I'm looking at you just now, Gustavo, right? And if I was in the same room as you, there'd be all sorts of dynamics going on. So my body language would be different. My questions would probably be different because you'd be responding differently. And so the actual interview process would be quite different if we were face to face. Now, that's a limitation because actually in any interview situation, it's what you do with your body that helps both of you to tell the story that you want to tell and tell that story properly. So so you come to know certain things online, but there's a lot of stuff that you don't know. For example, since the pandemic, I've met one or two people that I hadn't met before, and they're all smaller than I thought they were. Like I said, it's the strangest thing. Like, so you get to, so you've got that limitation because you forget that part of the interviewing process is embodied in that sense, and part of your communication is relational. And part of the story that you tell really needs both of you to be in the same room. So there's pluses and there's minuses, but there's definitely pluses.
John, Dustin Bennett here. I wonder if you could share more about the broader community of practice that has enriched and nourished and maybe changed your work. It's fascinating to hear about the individual experience and personal projects, but can you pull back the curtain a little bit more on the relationship between your work and a broader community of practitioners or scholars, and how and why that matters to you?
Yes, well, the kind of work that I'm interested in is inevitably interdisciplinary. So what's been fascinating for me over the years is to look and explore the way in which theology and theological ideas can transmit across disciplines. And so, for example, with my work here, I work a lot with the medical school. And the medical school here is, well, because the UK is quite secularized. Medical school here finds theological language very difficult because there's no space for that in the kind of healthcare system that we have. So people find the language of spirituality much more acceptable. So one of the interesting things here, and I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, is the way in which theological language has had to be translated into the language of the spiritual in order that the values and the kind of benefits that a theological perspective brings can be available within the grammar that's used within the healthcare system. Whereas when I do quite a lot of work down in Duke Divinity School, on their theology and medicine, health and culture program. And down there, because it's a much more religiously oriented culture, at least within the research triangle space, the language of theology translates very well. And so therefore, you're able to talk about theology without having to shave off the sharp edges, as you may have to do here. So you can talk about cross and resurrection and people say, yeah, that's helpful. Whereas if you try to do that here, people would say, I don't know what you mean. You know, or they would say that you're imposing my views upon you. But it'd be a very difficult conversation to have. And so because I'm working across these two different cultures and contexts, it just has, one of the things that I've learned is how complex it is to communicate theological language in an interdisciplinary context where people may not simply have that grammar or the cultural awareness or acceptance to be able to work with that. So these are good challenges, really interesting, but that's a fundamental challenge to the kind of work I'm involved with.
We'll go back online for our next question. I see we have a question from Laura Chikutzwitten. Sorry, that's my best shot.
I would not even try. Thank you. Thank you, John. I'm indebted to you for a lot of information and also resources that help me choosing my methodology. I have a question about presentation and presenting the work, because in the university where I am a lot of systematic theologians, and they order us theologians not according to discipline, but more according to theme or niche. And so I end up clashing with systematics or biblical theologians about how to present papers and stuff like that. And I wonder how you or others are dealing with that, because I get this feeling all the time, oh, I need to do it a different way. And then I read papers or articles from people doing ethnographic research. So I think, no, I'm not wrong, but so how do you handle these things, or have you encountered this? I should ask that first, of course.
Well, you do encounter that a lot. I mean, and it's interesting if you go to, for example, a meeting of the International Academy of Practical Theology, where you have exactly that kind of split. You have kind of practical theologians from the US and from the UK who have a particular way of doing theology, which involves church, which involves denominational issues, and which actually has some kind of commitment in that sense. But then you have another group of theologians there who are very against that, who have an idea that theology is science, and that the language of science is the language that theology should be communicated through. And within that organization, in my opinion, there never has been a resolution. I think these splits still sit there. And I think that depending on where, I don't know, where are you based, Laura?
Amsterdam, Holland.
Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so I've done a bit of work in the Free University in Amsterdam, and that same tension runs through the work. That
Yeah,
comes
it runs
in
there very much. Yes.
Yeah. So
and also gender thing maybe, but I'm not sure about it. But I suspect it's also a bit of a gender thing.
Yeah, I couldn't possibly comment. But the but what so that I don't think I can give you a solution. But I think I can say to you to be confident in what you do, that what you do is genuine practical theology, and the fact that people may want you to do something else or want you to shape and form it in a different way simply reflects a cultural difference within that community rather than an epistemological difference. In other words, what you're doing is equally as valid, but you may just simply be not using the language that affirms that within that context. So I would stick with what you do. I mean, you need to communicate, and you need to be courageous, but you're not on your own, because there's a lot of people that live in that tension.
Yeah.
Can I
Okay,
broaden this one further, Laura? Thank you for the question. And there are these debates about how we fit as practical theologians or ethnographers into various academic disciplines. It's also a much larger question of how are we doing public theology that's not for the academy, but for the people we actually study, the communities that we look at, the world. And I think it's really, that's something I've committed myself to. I'm not going to write everything to lock up behind a paywall that nobody can read for 2 years or ever if they don't have enough money. That's not the kind of public theology I want to do. It's important, and I've done those articles, and I will probably continue to write a few more of them. But I'm also interested in writing books for people who read them beyond the academy, and articles beyond the academy, and blogs every week, and all of that. So I'm just holding open. There's an even larger set of questions about for whom our work matters and to whom we write.
See, that's radical. It's almost like the gospel is for everybody.
Dang.
Thank you, both of you.
We have time for one more question. I think we'll take from the audience before we close out. Anybody? No? Any questions online, perhaps? Oh, Shesari?
Desiree, yes, thank you. Thank you so much, John. This has been excellent. And also the last comment that was made about who we're writing to in our audience. I want to go back to where you said, make sure that your method fits your personality. And I want to blend that with the last question of that resistance. What I interpret as resistance, the wall between the, I'll say confessional, maybe perhaps theologians and non-confessional. But I see it when you're dealing with academic advisors who don't necessarily trust the ethnographic method that you're using.
Right.
Maybe they feel that the audience doesn't have a capability to examine the phenomenology for themselves or to speak about it themselves. So they kind of want you to limit that ethnographic integration. Yeah. Can you talk about how to win over your advisor?
Well, it could be you have the wrong advisor, of course, but I say that seriously because there are some advisors that wouldn't take the research we've been discussing seriously, partly because they don't have the expertise and partly because they feel that's not the way that theology is done. So the question, how do you win them over? Well, you can only win them over if you can get them to an understanding of what you're doing and why it is significant. Right? So you won't necessarily win them over by having a wonderful piece of social scientific research if they don't understand what social scientific research is. But you can point them towards a body of scholars who are working in this area. And you can encourage them to read some of these things and to recognize that this is an area that is in development and has actually well established, but it is in development, and that it has credibility in academic circles. And so if they are willing to be flexible enough to at least have a look at, for example, the work that the Ecclesiology and Ethnography Network are doing, if they're happy to have a look at that, you might not persuade them, but what you might do is persuade them to take you seriously and to be able to support you on your journey, right? Even if they don't necessarily agree with every aspect of that journey. So my advice is pointing to what's happening and telling that you're part of something bigger than, well, bigger than them really, but bigger than their opinion is, because you're not talking about an opinion, you're talking about a solid body of ongoing research.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think the struggle for me personally is my advisor is a top scholar in this particular subject. My subject is Pentecostal theology, particularly, and looking at the altar and how the altar gives access to God. And I don't understand how to have that conversation without ethnography, but I guess maybe I need to think through what you said. So thank you. Good, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Christian and Eileen, for leading us in this discussion. Thank you, John, for taking time out of
you're welcome.
Today to share this with us. I began an introduction to you, referring to you as a living ancestor, and I'll just end on behalf of Princeton Theological Seminary to say the dead ancestors here buried in town are very happy that you still find yourself in the Presbyterian fold.
Well, thank you. I think.
just poking fun, but we're about good research, we're about good fun. So thank you so much, John. And
okay. Bye, everybody.